The ancient Greeks not only introduced the idea that there could be organic factors behind psychological disorders, but they also introduced the earliest psychological views. They believed that a person's environment and experience tended to shape that person and sometimes shape that person in pathological directions. And they introduced psychological treatments. Now, again, they didn't have a very good understanding of psychological processes, although their psychological treatments were not unreasonable and probably had some beneficial effect for at least some of the disorders that they might have recognized. I also want to point out we have a good historical base for the ancient Greeks and less of a base for other cultures. But for those cultures that we have any information on, the introduction of these ideas by the Greeks was not unique to Greece or to Western cultures in general. We know for a fact that very similar ideas were introduced in the Muslim world at roughly the same period or during later periods. Of course, when we think psychological causes, we always think of Freud. And in fact, Freud deserves respect for introducing psychological processes to the field of psychopathology. I would be remiss, however, if I started my discussion of psychological contributions with Freud, because Freud's work was actually part of work that had begun well before him. Mesmer's work with hypnosis, which was later studied more scientifically by Charcot, played a major role in many of Freud's psychological theories, especially the idea of suggestibility. As we're going to learn later, the people that Freud built most of his early theories on had a particular disorder that, among other things, included a fair amount of suggestibility, and hypnosis is a state in which people tend to be suggestive. Freud's contribution, his most important contribution, was probably the recognition of the unconscious. Now, there's no doubt the unconscious exists. We will talk later about extensive research that identifies it, and cognitive psychologists have studied the unconscious in great detail. The reason why it was so important is all of early psychology was focused on consciousness. The belief that everything we did we were aware of and we made decisions about. Well, that's not true. And Freud recognized that and built that into his theory. Of course, you're all familiar with the id, the ego, and the superego. That is part of the psychodynamic aspect of Freudian ideas. He believed that these various elements of our brain, some conscious, some unconscious, some a little of both, are constantly at war with one another, and that our behavior is very simple compared to the processes that lead to the decision of what behavior we will do. In contrast to Freudian ideas, I want to introduce some of the early behavioral perspectives, and there's actually two. And all I'm going to do in this lecture is introduce them. We'll talk more about them much later. The first is called classical conditioning, and it was the work of Pavlov. Probably most of you have heard of Pavlov's dogs, who learned to salivate to the sound of a bell instead of the meat that was used to induce salivation originally. Now, you might wonder why Pavlov was studying salivation. Pavlov actually won the Nobel Prize for his work on digestion. And salivation is the first stage of digestion. It occurs in the mouth. It helps to lubricate the food so it'll slide into the stomach, and it pre-treats the food so that the stomach acids can begin to break it down. And he did some very, very good work, enough to win a Nobel Prize. His work on classical conditioning was sort of a hobby. He discovered a problem when he was studying salivation. He had developed a very clever technique to measure how much a dog was salivating. He used a very minor surgical technique done under anesthesia with no pain after the dog had recovered, that put a tiny little tube in the side of the dog's mouth. And when the dog would salivate, that tube would suck the saliva into it through a process called capillary action. So how far it was sucked in was a pretty good measure of how much the dog was salivating. The problem was that the dog sometimes salivated when there was no food there. There was no early process of eating. They seemed to anticipate that food would be coming. And like any good scientist, he was intrigued by this. Now, some scientists might have tried to find a way to trick the dogs so they didn't know when the food was coming. But Pavlov realized there was something here worth studying. And so he did some systematic studies and discovered the principles of what we now call Pavlovian or classical conditioning. He discovered that there are some stimuli, like meat, that will produce certain response, like salivation in dogs. And they require no conditioning at all. So he called those stimuli unconditioned stimuli, and the response they produce unconditioned response. No conditioning needed. But when he paired an unconditioned stimulus, meat, with a stimulus that didn't do anything, a neutral stimulus, a bell, for example, and he did it repeatedly, in time that neutral stimulus started to produce the same response. So that neutral stimulus had been conditioned. We call it a conditioned stimulus, and the response that it produces is a conditioned response. Now, it turns out this is going to be very important in this course because almost all of our emotional responses are learned primarily, not exclusively, but primarily through classical conditioning. Again, when we talk about emotion in many of the disorders, I'll point that out. I want to emphasize again, this was an accidental discovery. It was a problem, and it could have been overlooked. One might say that it was a discovery that was serendipitous. But great scientists recognize interesting problems, and that's what made Pavlov famous. Now, those who study digestion know that Pavlov's major work was digestion, and that he won a Nobel Prize, but the rest of us know Pavlov only through his work on classical conditioning, and we may even believe that was his most important work. It probably wasn't, but certainly the most important work in our field. In case you're wondering what the device looked like that Pavlov used to measure classical conditioning, in this case of salivation, he took healthy dogs and planted this cannula into the side of their mouth. It was painless, and would present them with food. They were held in a light harness so that they would stay near the food, and he could measure very precisely how much and when they salivated during the entire process of eating. Without going into all of the details, I want to introduce some of the most important classical conditioning concepts. We already talked about the process of conditioning. It's based on putting a conditioned and unconditioned stimulus together until the conditioning occurs. The more you pair it, the stronger the conditioning. But if you take away the unconditioned stimulus, for example, with the dogs, the unconditioned stimulus was the meat, the conditioned stimulus was the bell. If you take that away, in time, the animal stops responding with the conditioned stimulus. So initially, the bell is enough to make the dog salivate. But if no food comes, eventually the dog stops salivating, and that's called extinction. What's interesting about extinction is it isn't that it is unlearned. What seems to be happening is instead it's being inhibited. Because if you have a single trial where the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are paired again, you get this massive recovery. It's not that you have to learn it again, you just bring it back. And even if there is no unconditioned stimulus, just a passage of time, you see a recovery. That's called a spontaneous recovery. And that shows that what is learned, this conditioning, isn't being unlearned, but rather is being inhibited. He also discovered two very important principles. One is discrimination, and the other is called generalization. Discrimination means recognizing the difference between two stimuli. So, for example, with the study with the dogs, you could have a bell and then a bell of a very different tone. And you can condition to the one tone, and in many cases that will generalize to the other tone. But it probably won't generalize to something that's completely different, like a light. Generalization is a process of taking learning in one condition and extending it to other similar conditions. Discrimination is the opposite. It's recognizing that two similar but not the same stimuli mean different things and responding differently to them. So, for example, there might be a light in the window of a store that's neon that says open. And when that stimulus is there, you can walk through the door and go in and buy something. And there might be another neon sign that says closed. And when that one is on, you can't go in because the door will be locked. There's no one there to sell you anything. Those are discriminative stimuli. If you've taken general psychology, you may know that most of what we know about the perceptual capabilities of animals is due to studies of discrimination. Can an animal see colors? Well, the way we test is to see if they can behave differently to different colors. So if they can see the difference between red and green, they can learn to behave differently to red and green. If they can't see the difference, of course, they can't learn it. I'm going to be even more brief in my discussion of operant conditioning, and the reason is that operant conditioning plays a major role in many of our models of psychopathology, so we're going to be talking about these issues over and over again, but I want to introduce the idea. All of operant conditioning is based on a single concept called the law of effect, introduced by Edward Thorndike that'll win you a trivia contest. The law of effect makes complete sense. Basically, if you do something and as a result something positive happens, you're more likely to do it. Makes sense, right? And if you do something and something negative happens afterwards, that will discourage you from doing it in the future. In other words, when we operate, when we behave, we pay attention to the consequences, and we adjust our behavior depending upon the consequences we've experienced. Although many people have contributed to our understanding of operant conditioning, probably the most important person was B.F. Skinner, who in fact introduced many of the terms that we will be talking about. He talked about reinforcement, which is applying a positive stimulus after a behavior to increase that behavior. He also talked about punishment, which is the application of an aversive stimulus after a behavior to decrease the behavior. There are some other concepts, though, that are important. I'll just introduce them briefly. We can reinforce, that is, make a behavior more likely to occur by applying a positive stimulus after the behavior, or by removing an aversive stimulus that's already there after the behavior. The first is called positive reinforcement. The second is called negative reinforcement. Most people think negative reinforcement is punishment. It is not. Punishment is the presentation of an aversive stimulus after a behavior, and it decreases behavior. Negative reinforcement is the removal of an aversive stimulus, and it increases behavior. If you have a bad headache and you take 2 Advil and the headache goes away, you're more likely to take 2 Advil because you are being negatively reinforced for taking Advil to remove the headache. By the way, you can also punish someone by removing an aversive stimulus. If you drive too fast and you get a ticket and they give you a big fine, they're taking away something positive, your money, and as a result, you're less likely to drive so fast. The final concept is very important. Most of the people who misunderstand the power of behavior therapy think in very simple terms. Their idea is that you wait for the person to do what you want them to do, and then you reinforce it. The problem is so many behaviors are so complicated that they would never happen spontaneously, so you'd never be able to reinforce them and make them more likely. But Skinner showed that you can take even the most complex behaviors and reinforce them gradually, a process he called shaping. So, in his terms, you reinforce successive approximations to the final behavior. In English, what that means is if they sort of do it, you reinforce them. And then once they're doing that sort of behavior, you want it to be a little bit closer to get reinforcement. And then a little bit more close, etc. And you continue that process until they're doing the final behavior that you want. Shaping is how all things are learned in operant conditioning, because almost all behavior is very complex. Now, I want to give you a quick example that some of you will be very surprised by. During World War II, Skinner trained pigeons in his lab to fly bombs into ships. Now, pigeons don't make very good pilots, but he essentially built an apparatus and taught the pigeon to peck in certain places to get rewards, to get food. And in time, they learned to do that very well. And then he designed a bomb where when they would peck in one place, it would move the fins of the bomb, essentially steering it as it was falling with gravity. And by moving, pecking in certain places, the fins so that the ship that the bomb was trying to sink was always in the middle, the pigeon essentially was able to guide the bomb into the ship. Now, I doubt that the pigeon appreciated that they were being a kamikaze pigeon and that they would, at least in that situation, get their rewards as they did during the training process. But that's pretty amazing, to teach a relatively simple organism, a pigeon, to do a very complex task through the process of shaping. Now, the behavioral perspective was more than just a process for changing behavior. It was a paradigm, and remember, a paradigm identifies what you study and how you study it. It is all-encompassing. John Watson was the scientist who probably had the most impact in creating the behavioral paradigm. Part of the behavioral paradigm is an attack on early psychology, which studied things that couldn't see, consciousness, and Freudian psychology, which studied things it couldn't see, like unconsciousness. and argued in effect that no science can exist without it being objective. So their focus wasn't on what's going on inside of the person, but rather on stimuli and the behaviors that changed as a result of the stimuli. So called stimulus response. Watson, for example, is famous for a particular study of a young boy named Little Albert. Little Albert was not afraid of white rabbits. In fact, he liked white rabbits. But Watson showed that you could make Little Albert afraid of white rabbits very easily by pairing a stimulus that causes fear, unconditioned stimulus, which is just loud noise. He took two metal rods and hit them together behind Little Albert. And it took almost no time for Little Albert to become afraid of the bunnies that he formerly was not afraid of. And that fear generalized to white rats and furry animals that were white, and even white beards on older men. Now, the intention was that they would show that you could reverse that process through counter-conditioning. Unfortunately, Little Albert's parents apparently got upset with the process that made Little Albert afraid of something he hadn't been afraid of, and they pulled him out of the study. Would they have been able to unlearn that fear? Yes, we know that for a fact. But there's a principle here that I'll be emphasizing throughout the course, and the principle is very simple. We are programmed to learn fear quickly. We can unlearn fear, but we're programmed to do it more slowly. We'll talk about the reasons for that later on in the course. Mary Covert Jones extended that principle and created a procedure that was later refined by Joe Wolpe. We now call systematic desensitization. It was the process by which you take a fear and gradually reduce it through exposure. I want to say two things here. The first is that Mary Covert Jones was one of the first female psychologists, and she was brilliant and made some important discoveries. This was only one of them. But she's often not covered as much as I think she should be. Joe Wolpe, in every publication he had, pointed out the importance of Covert Jones' work to his own work. And yet in most textbooks, Wolpe is featured and Mary Covert Jones is not mentioned. Fair? No, it's not. But, well, not all disciplines are fair. So we've come a long ways in our understanding of psychopathology, from early belief in demonic possession to some early recognitions that psychopathology could be natural, perhaps the result of our biology, perhaps the result of our experiences, to some fairly perceptive recognitions that are part of our modern perspective, that biology and psychological experience can indeed increase or decrease the risk for a particular disorder. We will be talking about all of these concepts in depth in later chapters.